In January 2019, deputies responded to a quiet home in Chuluota, Florida. Inside, 3 members of the same family were found dead. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication that anyone had broken in. The only person still alive in the house was 29-year-old Grant Amato, the son. At first, investigators considered a possible murder-suicide. But as forensic evidence and digital records were examined, that initial assumption began to unravel. What happened inside that house was not what it first appeared to be. Grant Amato was born on May 20th, 1989. By the time he turned 29, he was living back in his parents' home in Chuluota, a quiet residential area in Seminole County, Florida. The house belonged to his father, Chad Amato, a successful businessman in the insurance industry, and his mother, Margaret Amato. Grant's older brother, Cody, also lived there. From the outside, the household appeared stable. 2 adult sons under one roof, a close-knit family, no public signs of crisis. Grant had trained and worked as a nurse. He had been employed at a local hospital and, for a time, had followed a conventional professional path. But his employment ended after internal issues related to misconduct and allegations involving medication handling. The loss of his position marked a turning point. Without steady income, he moved back into his parents' home. What may have been temporary became extended dependency. Living at home again did not immediately signal collapse. Many adults return home during financial strain. But over time, tensions grew. Grant had no stable job. He did not contribute financially. His days increasingly centered around his computer. It was during this period that he began interacting online with a Bulgarian webcam performer named Silvia Venceslavova, known professionally as Sylvie. The interaction was not casual. According to trial testimony and financial records presented by prosecutors, Grant transferred large sums of money to accounts connected to her online performances. The amounts were not minor subscriptions. They were repeated, escalating payments. Investigators later stated that more than $200,000 had been transferred or spent in connection with the online relationship. Some of that money came from family accounts. Prosecutors outlined that approximately $60,000 had been taken from his brother Cody, and around $150,000 were connected to funds provided or borrowed by his father. The financial strain was significant enough that Chad Amato reportedly took out a loan secured by the family home. These transfers were not disclosed to the family at first. The spending continued quietly until discrepancies were discovered. Bank statements did not align with expected balances. Credit accounts reflected unusual withdrawals. When confronted, Grant admitted to sending money to the webcam model. The family intervened. According to court records and testimony, Chad Amato imposed strict conditions. Grant would have to seek treatment. He would be required to find employment. Contact with the webcam model had to stop immediately. Electronic devices were monitored. Access to certain accounts was restricted. At one point, Grant was removed from the home temporarily. The intervention was structured, not impulsive. The family sought therapy and attempted to establish boundaries. There was no public report of violence, no prior police involvement, no criminal record indicating physical aggression. The crisis was financial and behavioral, not outwardly violent. Grant returned to the house under agreed conditions. Those conditions included ending the online relationship and adhering to family rules. But digital records later showed that communication with the webcam model continued. Money transfers did not fully stop. Internet activity reflected ongoing contact. The family's trust had been damaged. The atmosphere inside the house shifted from support to supervision. Conversations reportedly became confrontational. The financial consequences were no longer abstract. Savings were depleted. Loans had been taken. The stability of the household was directly affected. By January 2019, the situation had reached a breaking point. According to prosecution arguments presented at trial, the final confrontation occurred shortly before the killings. Chad Amato allegedly demanded that Grant move out permanently. Access to remaining funds was cut off. There would be no further financial support. What had begun as an online relationship had evolved into a central conflict within the household. The spending was no longer hidden. The ultimatum was clear. Grant Amato's dependency was no longer tolerated. The financial support that had sustained him was ending. The house that had functioned as a safety net was closing. At this stage, there was still no crime. There was no public indication that violence would follow. The documented conflict was centered on money, deception, and control. But the escalation was measurable. Large financial losses, family confrontation, imposed restrictions, and the prospect of losing housing. The prosecution would later argue that these pressures formed the backdrop to what happened next. The defense did not dispute the financial conflict, but framed it differently, focusing instead on emotional strain and family tension. Regardless of interpretation, the facts were established through bank records, digital communications, and testimony. More than $200,000 had been transferred. Family members had intervened. Access to funds had been restricted. An ultimatum had been delivered. Within days, 3 members of the Amato family would be dead inside their own home. At that point, investigators would begin not with motive, but with a question. Who had access, and who had reason to remain inside the house when no forced entry was found? The answer to that question would not depend on speculation. It would depend on evidence already stored in financial records and digital timelines. By early January 2019, the financial damage inside the Amato household was no longer hidden. Bank statements had been reviewed. Transfers were traced. The numbers were not small enough to ignore or dismiss as impulsive spending. More than $200,000 had been lost over a period of months through online payments connected to a webcam performer in Bulgaria. The discovery forced the family into direct confrontation. The first wave of tension came when Chad Amato realized that significant funds were missing. Investigators later outlined that money had been taken not only from shared accounts, but also from his son, Cody. Roughly $60,000 had been withdrawn or transferred from Cody's accounts. Another large portion, approximately $150,000, was tied to funds provided or borrowed by Chad, including a loan secured against the family home. The realization that the house itself had become collateral changed the tone of the discussions. This was no longer a matter of personal embarrassment or private addiction. It was a financial crisis affecting every member of the household. Grant did not deny sending the money. According to testimony presented during trial, he admitted to the online relationship and acknowledged the transfers. He described his communication with the webcam model, Silvia Venceslavova, as meaningful. The family viewed it differently. They saw manipulation, deception, and escalating dependency. The confrontation was direct. Chad Amato imposed conditions. Grant would have to stop all contact immediately. He would need to seek professional help. He would be required to find employment and begin repaying what had been lost. The arrangement was framed not as punishment, but as a final opportunity. Access to financial accounts was restricted. Online banking credentials were changed. Shared access was removed. The family limited Grant's ability to move money. At the same time, his electronic devices were taken. According to court testimony, his phone and computer were confiscated in an effort to cut off communication with the webcam performer. The goal was simple: eliminate the source of the spending and force a reset. Grant was also required to attend counseling. The family arranged therapy sessions focused on compulsive behavior and financial responsibility. There was an expectation that he would comply fully. His continued residence in the home depended on it. For a brief period, the restrictions appeared to hold, but digital records later showed that communication had not completely stopped. Even with devices confiscated, Grant found ways to reconnect online. Investigators would later present evidence that new devices were used or that access was regained. The trust inside the house had deteriorated. Every conversation was filtered through suspicion. Financial monitoring continued. According to testimony, Chad Amato confronted his son repeatedly about inconsistencies in his explanations. At one point, Grant was temporarily removed from the house. He was told to leave. The exact duration of this exclusion was discussed during trial proceedings. He stayed elsewhere briefly before returning under stricter terms. The conditions for his return were explicit. He could remain only if he followed the rules set by his parents. That included no further contact with the webcam model, no additional spending, and compliance with therapy and job-searching requirements. The arrangement did not restore normalcy. It created surveillance. Grant's activities were watched. Conversations were recorded in memory. Every interaction was shaped by the previous deception. Financial documents continued to be reviewed. The magnitude of the debt had not been fully absorbed at first. When the numbers became clear, the emotional impact intensified. The family's savings had been depleted. The mortgage had been leveraged. Cody's funds were gone. What had begun as online spending had transformed into a collective loss. In the weeks leading up to January 24, 2019, the atmosphere inside the house was tense. According to prosecution arguments, the final escalation occurred shortly before the killings. Chad Amato allegedly told his son that he could no longer live in the home. The arrangement was ending. Grant would need to leave permanently. The decision represented a cutoff, not just emotionally, but financially. Without access to family support, Grant would lose housing and immediate resources. His ability to continue funding the online relationship would collapse entirely. This was the ultimatum. Investigators later emphasized that the timeline of this decision was critical. The demand that Grant move out coincided closely with the dates of the murders. Digital communications and call logs were examined to determine when the final confrontation occurred. The defense did not deny that arguments had taken place. Family members testified about heated discussions, voices were raised, accusations were exchanged. But there was no documented history of physical violence, no prior police calls, no restraining orders. The escalation remained internal. The restriction of accounts and confiscation of devices had another effect. It isolated Grant. His primary source of emotional engagement had been the online communication. With that cutoff, he faced both financial and social isolation within the same household. During the trial, prosecutors argued that the removal of financial access was decisive. They suggested that the loss of control over money and the imminent eviction created a situation in which Grant's options narrowed dramatically. Bank activity in the final days before January 24th was analyzed in detail. Investigators reviewed transaction timestamps. They examined login records. They reconstructed when access attempts occurred and from which devices. The narrative that emerged was not one of sudden explosion. It was gradual tightening. Each restriction added pressure. Each conversation reduced flexibility. Family members had attempted intervention through structure and therapy. But the structural approach also established clear consequences. If Grant did not comply, he would lose his place in the house. According to testimony, the final discussions were not vague. Chad Amato reportedly stated that his son would need to move out within days. This was not framed as temporary. It was definitive. The digital evidence showed that communication with the webcam model continued despite the ultimatum. Transfers had slowed, but had not entirely ceased. The relationship, from Grant's perspective, remained active. The family saw it as ongoing deception. Inside the house, 3 adults and 1 adult child lived in increasingly close proximity under strained conditions. Conversations revolved around money, repayment, and compliance. Trust had eroded completely. On January 24th, 2019, the tension reached its final stage. Investigators would later reconstruct the timeline hour by hour. But before examining the violence itself, they focused on this sequence of escalating restrictions. Discovery of financial loss, imposed conditions, confiscation of devices, temporary removal from the home, return under supervision, and final demand to leave. Each step was documented through testimony and records. The conflict had become binary, compliance or departure. There were no signs of reconciliation. There was no evidence of a financial solution. The money was gone. Within 24 hours of the reported ultimatum, 3 members of the Amato family would be dead. The question that investigators later asked was not whether there had been conflict. That was undisputed. The question was whether the conflict provided context or intent. The ultimatum marked the last clearly documented turning point before the murders. Everything after that would be reconstructed from evidence rather than conversation. On January 24th, 2019, the Amato family was inside their home in Chuluota, Florida. It was a Thursday. There was no public indication that the day would end differently than the tense weeks that had preceded it. The household consisted of 4 adults: Chad Amato, Margaret Amato, Cody Amato, and Grant Amato. According to testimony and digital records later introduced at trial, This would be the final full day the three victims were alive. The last confirmed communications from members of the family occurred throughout the day and into the evening. Text messages and digital activity helped investigators reconstruct the timeline. Devices belonging to Chad and Cody showed routine usage patterns earlier in the day. There were no emergency calls placed, no reports of outside visitors, no neighbors reported unusual activity that night. According to the prosecution's reconstruction, the murders occurred late on January 24th or during the early hours of January 25th. The exact minute of each death could not be determined, but medical examiners provided estimated time frames based on autopsy findings, body temperature, and scene analysis. What investigators later established was that all three victims died inside the residence. Chad Amato was found in an office area of the home. Margaret Amato was located in a bathroom area. Cody Amato was discovered in an upstairs bedroom. Each had suffered fatal gunshot wounds. According to court records, the weapon involved was a .45 caliber handgun belonging to Chad Amato. The distribution of the bodies inside different areas of the house became a central element in the prosecution's theory. The location suggested separate encounters rather than a single, chaotic confrontation. There were no signs of forced entry. Doors and windows showed no damage. Nothing indicated that someone had broken into the house. The absence of forced entry narrowed the list of possible scenarios significantly. Whoever committed the killings had either been invited inside or had already been inside the home. Grant Amato was present in the house during this period. According to statements introduced at trial, he later described discovering his father's body and suggested that the deaths may have been the result of a murder-suicide. The prosecution would argue that this narrative was constructed after the fact. When law enforcement arrived on January 25, 2019, they encountered a scene that did not immediately align with a simple explanation. The positioning of the bodies, the condition of the weapon, and the lack of evidence of struggle across the home raised questions. The medical examiner's findings were precise. Each victim had been shot. The number and placement of wounds varied. Autopsy reports indicated that the victims were shot in a manner consistent with close-range encounters. There were no defensive wounds documented that suggested prolonged physical struggle. The order of the killings became a subject of reconstruction during the trial. Prosecutors presented a timeline based on digital evidence, including phone usage and internet activity from Grant Amato's devices. They argued that after the first shooting, subsequent actions were deliberate and sequential rather than impulsive. One of the central components of the prosecution's case involved the theory that the crime scene had been staged to resemble a murder-suicide. The handgun was placed near Chad Amato's body. The configuration, according to investigators, was intended to imply that Chad had killed his wife and son before taking his own life. However, forensic analysis did not support that conclusion. Gunshot residue testing, blood pattern examination, and trajectory analysis were presented during trial. Experts testified that the positioning of the weapon was inconsistent with self-infliction. The angle of certain wounds did not align with what would be expected in a suicide scenario. Additionally, no evidence indicated that Chad had fired the weapon. Digital evidence further complicated the murder-suicide theory. Phone records and internet activity attributed to Grant Amato continued during the time frame in which prosecutors argued the killings had already occurred. This suggested presence and movement within the home after the victims were deceased. Investigators also examined the time between the estimated deaths and the 911 call. The gap raised questions. The prosecution emphasized that the delay allowed for staging and rearrangement inside the house. The defense challenged aspects of the timeline, arguing that precise sequencing could not be definitively established to the minute. However, the cumulative evidence presented by the state focused not on a single timestamp, but on consistency across digital logs, forensic findings, and physical layout. The house itself showed no signs of forced struggle across common areas. There were no overturned furniture pieces in shared spaces. The encounters appeared contained within specific rooms. This detail reinforced the prosecution's position that the victims were approached individually. Chad Amato was shot in the office area. Margaret Amato was shot in a bathroom. Cody Amato was shot in his bedroom. The separation of locations implied movement through the house. Investigators concluded that the sequence was controlled, rather than chaotic. Another detail presented during the trial involved the family dog. The animal was found unharmed inside the residence. There were no indications of disturbance consistent with an intruder entering violently. Financial motives were not directly evident at the scene itself, but prosecutors tied the timing of the murders closely to the ultimatum delivered days earlier. The killings occurred within a narrow window after Grant had been told he would need to leave the home. When deputies secured the house, they documented the absence of forced entry, the placement of the weapon, and the condition of each body. Photographs and measurements were introduced later in court to support the state's argument that the scene had been intentionally arranged. The initial suggestion of murder-suicide was considered but did not withstand forensic scrutiny. The physical evidence did not support the idea that Chad Amato had fired multiple shots across different rooms and then killed himself in a manner consistent with the wound patterns observed. Instead, investigators focused on the person who had both access and presence. Grant Amato remained inside the house when deputies arrived. The timeline from late January 24th into January 25th became the central framework of the case. Each movement, each digital interaction, and each physical placement was examined against the theory of staging. By the time the medical examiner completed the autopsies and digital analysts reconstructed device activity, the narrative had shifted. What initially might have been interpreted as a family tragedy driven by a single shooter turned into a methodical examination of intent and sequence. The key elements were clear: 3 gunshot victims in separate areas of the home, no forced entry, a firearm belonging to one of the victims, and a surviving son whose digital footprint overlapped with the estimated window of death. The night of January 24th to 25th did not present itself as chaotic randomness. It presented a contained series of events inside a closed environment. The break between the outward appearance of a murder-suicide and the forensic reconstruction of deliberate killings would define everything that followed in the court. When investigators secured the Amato home and began building a case that could stand in court, the physical scene was only one part of the picture. The more decisive work happened in parallel: a reconstruction of what was happening on screens, across accounts, and inside device logs during the same window in which 3 people were killed. In this case, digital evidence did not function as background color, it functioned as a clock. Deputies and detectives collected multiple devices and stored them as evidence: mobile phones, computers, and related storage. The goal was straightforward. If the murders happened inside a closed house with no forced entry, the timeline would likely be reflected in what the surviving person did before, during, and after the estimated time of death. That meant looking at what was accessed, when it was accessed, and from where. The first step was establishing baseline use. Investigators documented normal patterns: when family members typically used their phones, what devices were shared, which accounts were logged in, and which devices belonged to which person. That groundwork mattered because the defense later argued that digital activity can be misleading when devices are shared or left unattended. Investigators needed attribution that could hold under cross-examination. Once devices were imaged and examined, analysts focused on the period surrounding January 24th and January 25th. They were not looking for a single smoking gun message. They were looking for continuity, sequences of actions that, when placed alongside the estimated death window, would either support or undermine explanations offered later. A major focus was internet activity. Digital forensic analysts reviewed browsing history, session logs, and application usage. Even when users attempt to delete history, traces can remain in cached files, account histories, and system-level logs. Investigators examined what sites were accessed, how long sessions lasted, and whether activity continued after the state argued the victims were already dead. They also looked at whether the device was actively used or simply left open, because those are different conditions. Active use leaves patterns: scrolling, clicking, typing, app switching, and repeated interactions. This mattered because the defense could claim confusion, shock, or immediate emergency response. Investigators instead presented a picture of digital continuity that did not match a sudden crisis. Messaging and communication were another pillar. The relationship with the CAM model was central to the background conflict, so investigators examined records related to that contact. Direct communications were available, platform histories were obtainable, and metadata showing access attempts and account sessions. This was not only about motive, it was about behavior under pressure. If an ultimatum had been issued, investigators wanted to know whether contact continued anyway, and whether attempts to maintain that contact overlapped with the time frame of the killings. Where direct message content was not accessible, access patterns still carried weight. Logins, session times, and platform usage can show persistence even without full text. The state's broader argument was that the online relationship was not a past event. It was an ongoing driver of decisions and deception. Digital records were used to anchor that claim in something measurable. Location data, where available, was examined in a careful and limited way. In many cases, phones generate location artifacts through GPS, Wi-Fi connections, and cell tower associations. The precision varies. Investigators typically avoid overstating what cell tower data can prove, because it can place a device within an area rather than a specific room. But when a device remains at one location through a critical window, that stability can still matter. Analysts looked at whether devices associated with family members were stationary, whether they stopped generating new movements, and whether the surviving person's device showed continuity of use inside the home. The goal was not to claim that a phone watched the murders. The goal was to show that the digital footprint aligned with presence and sequence, not with an outside intruder narrative. Financial transactions were also examined as part of the timeline. The money was a documented trigger in this case, so investigators pulled account records, transfer histories, and payment logs connected to the online activity. Those records served two purposes. First, they supported the magnitude of the conflict inside the house. Second, they provided timestamps. Financial systems timestamp transfers and access attempts. Even when a transfer is pending, the log of an attempted transaction or account login can show intent and behavior during a critical period. Investigators mapped those timestamps alongside other data: device usage, call logs, and known events. The result was a layered timeline that could be explained clearly to a jury. Call logs and phone events were part of that layer. Analysts reviewed outgoing and incoming calls, missed calls, and voicemail activity, along with the timing of any emergency call that brought deputies to the house. They examined the gap between estimated time of death and law enforcement notification. That gap mattered because it created room for staging, movement, and planning. In court, delays are rarely interpreted on their own. They become meaningful when they align with other activity that does not match panic or immediate help seeking. Another important category was device-level system evidence. Phones and computers record events that users often forget exist. Unlock times, screen-on events, app launch histories, background services, Wi-Fi connections, and battery charging patterns. These artifacts help establish whether a device was actively being handled or left untouched. They can also show whether a device was moved, rebooted, or altered during a window that the prosecution considers crucial. In cases involving staging, these details can be decisive. A stage scene often requires time, and time leaves traces. Not all traces are dramatic. Many are mundane. A device being unlocked again and again, a browser opening, a message being checked, a payment platform being accessed, or a system event indicating continued normal behavior while the household should, under an innocent narrative, be in crisis. The investigation also examined whether devices were used in ways consistent with concealment. Digital concealment does not always mean sophisticated hacking. Often it means deletions, account logouts, wiping a search history, or trying to reset a device. Even failed attempts can be logged. Investigators look for sudden changes, a device that normally retains history but shows a gap, an account that suddenly logs out everywhere, a phone that is reset or has activity patterns inconsistent with the user's typical behavior. Whether such concealment attempts were present and how they were interpreted became part of the prosecution's broader narrative. The state argued this was not a spontaneous event followed by immediate calls for help. It was an event followed by choices. Digital evidence also helped investigators test competing explanations. A murder-suicide theory suggests one person commits the killings and then dies. In such a scenario, you would expect digital activity from that person to stop abruptly. You would also expect other household members' devices to stop being actively used. When investigators argued that the scene was staged to resemble a murder-suicide, digital continuity became a way to challenge that appearance. If a person is dead, they do not continue to unlock devices or generate new usage patterns. If 3 people are dead, their communication patterns should stop as well. Analysts could not claim perfect certainty about every single event, but they did not need to. The strength of digital evidence in court often comes from accumulation rather than a single record. A jury is not asked to convict based on one login. They are asked to consider whether the pattern fits the story they are being told. In this case, investigators presented digital records as a reconstruction tool. Combined with the lack of forced entry and the physical distribution of victims in separate areas of the house, the digital timeline supported a controlled sequence rather than a sudden external attack. It also undercut the defense's ability to lean on ambiguity. Without digital evidence, a defense can argue that the time window is too broad, the sequence too unclear, the scene too confusing. With digital evidence, the window narrows, behavior becomes measurable, delays become explainable, and "I don't know" becomes harder to maintain when devices record what was done and when. By the time the case reached trial, the digital component had become one of the prosecution's most effective tools. It allowed investigators to move beyond motive and into timing. It allowed them to argue not just that conflict existed, but that actions followed conflict in a sequence consistent with planning and staging. The result was a timeline built from multiple sources: phones, computers, financial systems, and communication logs. Not one of these elements was treated as perfect on its own. Together, they formed a record of activity that did not align with an innocent narrative of discovery and immediate emergency response. That misalignment between what was claimed and what the digital trail showed was the turning point that pushed the case from suspicion to prosecution. The trial of Grant Amato began in July 2019 in Seminole County, Florida. By that point, the investigation had moved from suspicion to formal prosecution. Amato faced 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for the killing of his father, Chad Amato, 1 for his mother, Margaret Amato, and 1 for his brother, Cody Amato. Under Florida law, first-degree murder requires proof of premeditation or felony murder under specific circumstances. In this case, the prosecution pursued a theory of premeditated killing. The state did not argue that the deaths were the result of sudden emotional explosion or accidental discharge. Instead, prosecutors framed the killings as deliberate actions carried out after a period of escalating conflict inside the home. Jury selection drew attention because of the media coverage surrounding the case. The combination of online obsession, large financial losses, and a triple homicide inside a suburban home had generated national headlines. Potential jurors were questioned about exposure to news reports and whether they could remain impartial. Once opening statements began, the prosecution laid out its structure clearly. The state emphasized 3 pillars: motive rooted in financial and emotional dependency, forensic evidence inside the house, and digital records establishing timeline and presence. Prosecutors argued that the ultimatum delivered by Chad Amato days earlier, demanding that Grant leave the home and cutting off financial access, provided the immediate trigger. The defense strategy did not deny that Grant Amato had been present in the house. Instead, it focused on undermining the prosecution's interpretation of intent and sequence. Defense attorneys highlighted the complexity of digital evidence, suggesting that timestamps and usage patterns could be misinterpreted. They also questioned whether the state had proven the precise order of deaths beyond reasonable doubt. The defense avoided framing the case around a dramatic alternative suspect. There was no serious claim of forced entry or unknown intruder supported by physical evidence. Instead, the approach centered on challenging the strength of the prosecution's reconstruction. If jurors could find reasonable doubt in the timeline or in the interpretation of forensic data, the defense argued, conviction on first-degree murder should not follow. Throughout the trial, expert testimony played a central role. Forensic pathologists explained the medical findings, gunshot wounds, trajectories, and estimated timeframes. Crime scene analysts described blood pattern evidence and the positioning of the victims in separate rooms. Digital forensic experts walked jurors through device logs, internet history, and financial records. The prosecution emphasized the absence of forced entry. They reiterated that doors and windows showed no damage. They presented the firearm as belonging to Chad Amato and argued that its placement near his body had been intended to simulate a murder-suicide. One of the most consequential arguments revolved around staging. Prosecutors argued that after killing his family members, Grant Amato attempted to arrange the scene to suggest that his father had killed his wife and sons before taking his own life. The state contended that this narrative collapsed under forensic scrutiny. The defense countered by urging caution. They reminded jurors that crime scenes can be chaotic and that post-event interpretations can be influenced by hindsight. They also suggested that emotional distress and family conflict do not automatically translate into premeditated murder. Financial records were introduced as motive evidence. The prosecution outlined the transfers exceeding $200,000 connected to the webcam model. They described the loans secured against the family home. They detailed the restrictions imposed on Grant in the days before the killings. The narrative presented to the jury was one of financial desperation and imminent displacement. The defense acknowledged the financial conflict, but warned against allowing it to overshadow the burden of proof. They argued that bad decisions and financial obsession do not equate to homicide. As the trial progressed, the jury heard from family acquaintances and law enforcement officers who had responded to the scene. Deputies described what they observed upon entering the home: 3 deceased individuals in separate areas and no signs of forced entry. Their testimony reinforced the prosecution's claim that whoever committed the crimes had access and familiarity with the house. Closing arguments condensed weeks of testimony into 2 competing interpretations. The prosecution framed the case as a methodical triple homicide carried out after an ultimatum that cut off financial lifelines. They argued that digital evidence demonstrated calculated behavior during and after the killings. They urged jurors to consider the totality of evidence rather than isolating individual uncertainties. The defense focused on reasonable doubt. They highlighted gaps in the state's reconstruction and questioned whether the timeline was precise enough to prove premeditation beyond doubt. They reminded jurors that speculation cannot substitute for proof. After deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. Under Florida law at the time, the penalty phase required jurors to consider whether the death penalty was appropriate. Prosecutors sought capital punishment, arguing that the killings were premeditated and involved multiple victims. The defense argued against death, emphasizing mitigating factors. Ultimately, the jury did not unanimously recommend the death penalty. As a result, the court imposed 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The sentencing formalized what the investigation and trial had concluded. Grant Amato would spend the remainder of his life in prison. The verdict marked the legal end of the case, though appeals would follow. In 2021, a Florida appellate court affirmed the conviction, upholding the jury's findings and the sentence imposed. The trial transformed digital records, forensic data, and financial documents into a narrative that convinced 12 jurors beyond reasonable doubt. It established that the absence of forced entry, the staging theory, and the digital timeline were not isolated facts but interconnected pieces of a deliberate sequence. The courtroom phase did not introduce dramatic confessions or unexpected revelations. Instead, it demonstrated how layered evidence, financial, forensic, and digital, can converge to support a finding of premeditated murder. The outcome left no ambiguity in sentencing: 3 convictions for first-degree murder and life imprisonment without parole. The legal system had reached its conclusion. After the guilty verdicts were returned in 2019, the legal process did not end immediately. Like many defendants convicted of first-degree murder, Grant Amato exercised his right to appeal. The appeal did not introduce new evidence or alternate suspects. Instead, it focused on procedural and legal arguments, whether the trial court had made errors significant enough to warrant reversal or retrial. In 2021, Florida's 5th District Court of Appeal reviewed the case. After examining the record, the appellate court affirmed the convictions. The ruling upheld both the guilty verdicts and the life sentences imposed by the trial court. With that decision, the core legal findings remained intact. There was no retrial, no reduction of charges, no alteration of sentence. Grant Amato remains incarcerated under a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Public records list his placement within the Florida Department of Corrections system. His legal status is final in practical terms. 3 convictions for first-degree murder, affirmed on appeal. The case did not disappear after sentencing. It continued to attract attention because of the elements that made it distinct: online financial dependency, large monetary losses, and the central role of digital evidence. Media coverage and later documentary projects revisited the timeline, but the underlying court findings did not change. One of the most notable aspects of the Amato case is how heavily it relied on digital reconstruction. Unlike older homicide investigations built primarily on eyewitness testimony and physical trace evidence, this prosecution integrated phone logs, internet session records, financial transfers, and metadata into a cohesive timeline. Digital evidence did not replace traditional forensic work, it reinforced it. In court, digital artifacts were presented alongside autopsy findings and scene analysis. This combination allowed prosecutors to narrow the estimated sequence of events with greater precision than would have been possible in earlier decades. Device unlock times, browsing sessions, and account access logs became chronological markers. They did not reveal intent directly, but they demonstrated activity patterns that either aligned with or contradicted statements. The increasing prevalence of digital records in modern investigations has changed how juries evaluate cases. In the Amato trial, the prosecution did not rely on a confession. It relied on accumulation. The weight of digital timestamps, financial histories, and scene consistency formed the backbone of the case. Another element that distinguished this case was the absence of public warning signs of violence. Prior to January 2019, there were no documented reports of physical assaults within the Amato household. No restraining orders, no prior domestic violence charges. The conflict was financial and behavioral. The escalation, as presented in court, occurred inside a family system already strained by debt and deception. That does not mean there were no signs of crisis. There were clear indicators of financial instability and compulsion. The large transfers to the webcam model were documented. The loan secured against the family home was documented. The imposed restrictions and ultimatum were documented through testimony. But those factors alone did not predict homicide in a visible way. From a legal standpoint, the case illustrates how internal family conflict can culminate in violence without public intervention points. Law enforcement became involved only after the killings had occurred. There had been no prior arrest, no protective order request, and no domestic disturbance call that might have signaled escalating danger. The online component also remains central to discussions of the case. Prosecutors characterized the relationship with the webcam performer as an obsession fueled by repeated financial transfers. Defense attorneys did not dispute the transfers, but framed them as evidence of poor judgment rather than motive for murder. The jury ultimately interpreted the financial collapse and the ultimatum as part of the broader context for premeditation. It is important to distinguish between correlation and causation. The presence of online spending and debt does not automatically produce violence. In this case, however, the prosecution argued that the ultimatum, loss of financial access and housing, created a decisive turning point. The jury accepted that interpretation within the framework of the evidence presented. In the years following sentencing, the Amato case has been referenced in discussions about digital dependency and financial exploitation through online platforms. Law enforcement agencies have increasingly emphasized the importance of tracking digital financial behavior in fraud and homicide investigations alike. The case serves as a documented example of how online financial activity can become intertwined with broader criminal conduct. The appellate affirmation in 2021 solidified the legal outcome. There has been no successful challenge to the conviction since. Public records continue to list the sentence as life imprisonment without parole. Beyond the courtroom, the broader context remains grounded in documented facts. A family home in Chuluota, Florida, escalating financial losses exceeding $200,000, imposed restrictions and an ultimatum, 3 fatal shootings inside separate rooms, no forced entry, digital activity overlapping with the time frame of death, a stage scene rejected by forensic analysis, a jury conviction, and a life sentence affirmed on appeal. There are no unresolved questions within the legal record. The verdict did not depend on speculation about personality traits or psychological profiling. It depended on evidence presented under oath and tested through cross-examination. The Amato case stands as a modern example of how homicide investigations now integrate digital systems into reconstruction. It also illustrates how private financial collapse within a family can escalate without outside intervention until the moment law enforcement is called for the first time. The final outcome remains unchanged. 3 victims, 1 surviving family member convicted of their murders, and a sentence that will keep him in custody for the remainder of his life. The record, as established in court, is closed.